chapter 14 for the NASM certification prep, and for just general purposes here, we're going to be getting into the OPT model in particular, but what they like to call an integrated program design. All right. And what they mean by integrated, it just basically, again, it's one of those things where you're taking multiple components of something and putting it together in a systemized or systematic format, so that you can then create proper exercise programming for those individuals that you're working with, so that it's more geared toward them versus somebody else. So let's see what we can kind of come up with here. So with your program design, what we're going to kind of hit on is, you know, the traditional approaches, or traditional programming. And so, depending upon who you are, and depending upon what your background is, depending upon what it is that you've researched, is there any sort of scientific basis? Um, are you getting mixed feelings? Are you getting, the proper information that you need to get? All of this kind of comes out in this traditional program. So, um, this is why it's very, very scary for people who, if you have a good background in something and you feel very comfortable, you know, you going back to the advent of the bro science, even though it's unsupported, there has been a lot of really positive things that have come from the mentality of bro science. But, obviously research dictates a lot of this because we see where the improvements come from. We understand where things, are moving toward. But you got to understand that there are some aspects that you will find out in the real world, and you're going to look at it and be like, oh, this seems really interesting, but maybe it was just created to be created, and that does happen, and it's not something that's unheard of. So you have to take everything that you're looking at with a grain of salt when it comes to, like it says here, scientifically unsupported, right, in this area. Okay. So, what are we looking at from this standpoint that's going to take us through the remainder of this chapter is we're looking for safe, effective, and productive. That's exactly what we want to hone in on. Okay. It still needs to be individualized. It's still going to come from some of the experiences that the fitness professional has, but it's going to be safe, it's going to be effective and do its job, and it's going to be productive to get you results that you need. Okay. But your first training programs may not be the best, and that's not a bad thing. But what that means is that as you get better at understanding what we would call the acute variables and the differentiation between exercises that you can do that are modified for that particular individual, you can end up with something that really is not complex. It's very easy to follow, and it's something that will be very, very productive to get the results that are needed for your clients, for your athletes, for whoever you're working with. Okay. Um, so that's really what it comes down to. Okay. But again, structured, scientifically based. That's what we're looking for. We don't want scientifically unsupported. So we want to look at these things very critically. Well, if you're going to follow the OPT model from NASM, then you're going to, there is some science behind it. There is some understanding that this has worked. I mean, from a personal perspective, from my personal perspective, I've used the OPT model during some powerlifting phases that I've had for growth and for max strength, which are phases 4 and 5, and it really gets kind of interesting. Um, it really gets kind of interesting because you know the parameters that you follow, the rest periods, things like that, all of those things come into play, and they really show how challenging the programming is. So let's kind of rock and roll through that and see what that brings for us and how we can get a better understanding of that. So with program design in general, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's a purposeful plan. It's meant to achieve goals. It's meant to get you to where you want to be. But it's also a roadmap. All right, it's kind of fitting all these really interesting puzzle pieces together to be able to give these clients, athletes, individuals, something that they can, get to, something they can achieve and continuously achieve. Again, you don't want to set people up for failure, but you still need to challenge them so that they can have, success along the way to really eventually hit their goals. Okay. So one of the aspects that I think is really important on this page is this right here, being able to comprehend. You got to be able to understand what we're talking about here, so that if we're talking about tempo, well, why is tempo important? If we're talking about reps and sets, why is that important? And why is volume, reps times sets, and in terms of volume, really important? So we have to take that into perspective here. Okay. So let's think about asking yourselves these questions here. What exercises are most appropriate for that particular person? What exercises contraindicate? What exercises should you not be doing because they may cause harm versus improvement for that particular person? If they have a shoulder injury, you got to be very particular about what shoulder movements you're going to do. What exercise intensities are appropriate? Intensity is meaning weight lifted or some other aspect, speed, or added weight to a particular body weight movement. It just depends on what it is. But what is going to be appropriate for them? Well, it depends on what parameters you want to follow and what level of the OPT model you want to be in. Okay. What's the max? How many exercises? The maximum amount of exercises that are appropriate for your client. Reps and sets, like I talked about before, and then days per week, or what we would call frequency. Okay, all of those things need to be answered, because then that's where the driving force is to be able to dictate what you're going to put together. All right, and then that when you're putting all that together, what you're really doing is, excuse me, what you're really doing is you're creating what's called a periodization schedule. And periodization really just means, okay, what phases do you want to work in? What levels do you want to work in, so that you can justify to your people that this is the right way to go? Okay, like it says here, there's adaptations that occur physiologically for the parameters that you're going to follow, which are the three main ones, which is stabilization, strength, and power. Now, stabilization is its own entity. Strength is broken up into three different levels, and then power is its own entity. All right. But all of those adaptations must occur so that you can end up becoming more there could be better progression, and then you can get you could basically get what is a foundation to build upon. One of the things that you have to be aware of is that new people are probably going to most likely spend the majority of their time early on in the stabilization phase, and then they'll progress. There are people that are going to come to you that are more well off and they're more suited for movement, and that's where assessment will guide you to where they should be starting. Do they have a good base for exercise? And if they do, where do you want to start them? And that's where that's another good question, is where do they begin? What phase of level do they, what phase of the OPT model do they want to be in? Okay. So with those five phases, there's the five phases we said: the stabilization. All right. And if we actually, I'll just pull it up right here. There's, the bottom level of stabilization. Then you go into your three different levels of strength, which are strength endurance or muscular endurance, hypertrophy, maximal strength, and then power. Okay. Those are your five levels right there. But, what are the questions you want to know? How do these phases promote specific adaptations? Well, stabilization, we're hoping, is going to be able to, basically create a stable environment for the body to be able to function correctly at the local and global levels before you get to the movement levels. Okay, and that's really what happens. We want to get those fine-tuned, smaller muscles that stabilize the trunk, the LPHC, the trunk, the lower and the upper body, the spine, and the pelvis, to all function correctly. Okay, and then what are the acute variables for each phase? Well, we'll talk about those in a second. Well, the reason why we want to make sure we are asking these questions is because we need to be able to make sure we're getting the right selection of exercises, we're using the right acute variables, and then at that point there, you're applying them in a manner that will be individualized and properly planned and programmed for each population who has their own set of goals. Okay, and that's really what you're looking for. Okay. So what you're going to do is we're going to scroll. This is going to be, these sections here are going to take us through the rest of the information we're going to talk about. Acute variables, periodization, 5 phases of the OPT, kind of break those down a little bit more. And then how do we apply them? Okay, so that we can start to be able to program effectively. All right, I showed you this before, but there's your phase one is your stabilization endurance. And again, as a general person, that's probably where you're going to begin. Strength, endurance, hypertrophy, max strength, and power. Now, you don't have to say you're working in a very specific one and then you move on to the next one and then to the next one to the next one. You can maneuver through them, but again, it depends on the person that you're working with. So if you're working in a hypertrophy base, for the OPT model, you can use some things that might have some incorporation of max strength. If you're in hypertrophy, there are some things that you might still want to be using with the strength endurance method. So it just depends on the person and what they're trying to achieve. But it doesn't mean that you have to go once you feel as though they're done with level one, which is phase one, stabilization endurance. They have to go to level two, so on and so forth. So you can look at it from that perspective. All right. So acute variables. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to ask, what are they? All right. How do they affect your desired adaptation? Well, if you're using a certain volume and a certain rep and set count, okay, that's going to come into play there. And why, how are they going to affect it? Well, rest period, all that stuff is going to take into account here. And then how do they affect the overall training program? So those are the things that you want to ask when it comes to these aspects of the acute variables, okay? So the acute variables, like it says here, the most fundamental components of designing it. It's going to be all of these things right here. Okay, these are the reasons why, or these are the reasons how, or these are the main variables, the main aspects of your training that you're going to provide your person. And this is the stuff that you program for yourself. Repetitions, all right, the movement that you're using, and one repetition is one repetition. 10 is 10. Right? Is it 10? Is it 10 total? Is it 10 per side? Okay, that's what we need to be very specific on. Sets are very, are actually, rather easy to comprehend because it's the amount of reps you're doing per grouping. Okay, training intensity, training volume, rep tempo, repetition tempo, rest intervals, exercise selection, exercise order, training duration, and then training frequency. All these are acute variables. Now, you've probably seen these in some way, shape, or form. I know that you've definitely seen a lot of this information when we went through things like, flexibility, balance, core, plyo or reactive, and then your speed, agility, and quickness. And then when we got to the resistance training section, you saw all these rep sets, you saw the rest periods, things like that. All those things were on the charts that were inside of the book, and then obviously in some of these videos that you might have watched previously, so that you understand what you're looking at. So we're really trying to break each one of these down, okay? And that's what we're going to do coming up. That's why I'm talking about them right now, but we're going to break each one of them down. So with reps, all right, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's one complete movement of a particular exercise broken into your concentric, isometric, and eccentric phases because it's full range of motion. All right, and then really the main focus here is it's a count. It's a number that's given to you for a specific parameter that you're trying to follow, whether it be phase 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of the OPT model. Okay. With reps, if you look here, this is the rep continuum. Okay, power, max strength, hypertrophy, muscular endurance, and stabilization. Those usually work hand in hand in terms of like rep counts and volume and stuff like that. So it is something that is very similar. So just because it says muscular endurance and stabilization, they're still two separate phases, but their reps, their sets, their rest periods, things like that are going to be very similar. But you can see here with power, you're talking about 1 to 10 reps, max strength 1 to 5, hypertrophy 6 to 12, and then muscular endurance or stabilization is higher with that 12 to 20 range. These are specific levels that you want to try to follow. Okay, there are definitely levels that you want to follow, and there are definitely levels that you really want to consider paying attention to when you're working in those training phases, or as they say, training adaptations here. They will get you the results that you need for the goal that you're trying to achieve. And again, it's very individualized and specific to the person that you're working with and where their goals are. Okay. Sets, on the other hand, are, like it says, a group of consecutive repetitions or the number of reps that you do per exercise. Okay. So repetitions are reps per grouping is a set. Okay. So There's your factors, okay? Repetitions, okay? How many reps are you doing? That's going to be determined for how many sets, So if you're doing four sets of 12 reps, that you got 4 sets, But then you take reps times sets, and that's volume. We'll talk about that in a little bit. For your set, you're talking about your training intensity, how many exercises you're going to be doing. What training level are you at? What phase? Okay, phase 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of the OPT model. And then recoverability or rest time. Okay. And there really is an inverse relationship to the amount of sets, reps, and intensity. It's going to be very difficult for you to do high numbers of sets with high numbers of reps with high levels of intensity. So typically the rule of thumb is if you're doing more repetitions, more reps and sets together, then the intensity will be down. If you're doing lower reps at a particular set level, the intensity can be up. Okay? And that's a rule of thumb. But again, you're trying to do a high level of volume at a super high level of intensity or weight lifted, it'll be very, very challenging. Okay? And it'll probably, if you're trying to do 10 reps at 90% of your max, that's not going to happen. That's a very high level of number of reps at a super high intensity that will be very difficult. Now, will it challenge you? Yeah, but doing 10 reps at 90%, that if you can hit that number, that probably means that your 1 rep max is not accurate. But we'll talk. That's something to talk about at another time. All right, so there's your sets. There's your power, your max strength, your hypertrophy, and then your muscular endurance stabilization. There's your numbers right there. But that's exactly what I was talking about. Fewer sets, higher reps, lower intensity. More sets, lower reps, higher intensity. And that's what you're getting for your endurance and hypertrophy versus your strength and your power. Okay? Although hypertrophy, you assume that you're trying to get growth. It's not so much. See, now with hypertrophy, it's kind of a little skewed because it's moderate reps to moderate intensity. So I think that that's a little bit different there. But for the most part, I mean, it is considered lower intensity versus strength and power. So we can definitely lump it up to that. Okay. So with your training intensity or weight lifted, you can see that it's the amount of effort that you're doing compared to your maximal effort. Now, to say that you can do a max effort on every day, yeah, that can be done, but it doesn't mean that you're going to hit 100% every day, and it's going to be pretty hard to be able to do that every day. So you usually are going to work at some percentage base or some level of effort base for your versus your 1 repetition max. So with power, it gets a little skewed here, but it says 30 to 45% of your 1 rep max. So that's not very high in terms of intensity, but what are you doing? You're working at max speed with that 30 to 45%. Okay? So even though the load is light, you're going to be trying to move and propel the body in a very functional yet fast way. Okay, remember it's force times distance divided by time is your power. Well, yeah, you're trying to move a load a certain distance very quickly, and that's really what it comes down to, or up to 10% of your body weight. So that could be anything for. Typically, the 10% usually revolves around like weight vests or medicine balls. All right, more things that you're going to use for explosive movements. Okay, that's like a lot of the accessory equipment that would be considered. Max strength wise, there you go, 85 to 100% of your max effort or 1 rep max. Hypertrophy is about 75 to 85. See, that's that moderate range. And then muscular endurance and stabilization is about 50 to 70% of your 1 rep max. And those are your ranges to work within for your intensity. Okay, not written in stone. Just because you have 85% of your 1 rep max does not mean, if you go back, does not mean that you have to do 6 sets. I mean, there have been times where I've programmed 8 sets for somebody and it, at 85%. But again, my rep range is most likely going to be on the lower end if I'm doing that. Okay. That's what I'm referring to when you talk about if you're going higher levels of sets, the reps are going to be low, but your expectation for how high of a weight they're going to be lifting is going to be high. Okay. So with training intensity 2, to make things more challenging, you can use unstable multi-planar environments that can enhance the level of intensity that you're really trying to use. Okay. Now, what's happening is you are requiring a lot more joint stabilization, so you're going to have more neuromuscular recruitment, more motor units are going to be called upon to do this. But when you work in an unstable or multiplanar or both combined environment, typically it increases the intensity. It does not mean that the weight that is lifted is increased. It means that it makes the movement harder. It does not mean that you can use more weight. So we have to be very clear on that, because when you're doing something unstable, if you're trying to do just say you're trying to max load your flat bench dumbbell press. Okay, so there's no incline, there's no decline, it's flat bench. If you're trying to do that and you're trying to use 100-pound dumbbells and you've never really used them before, but you got 3 reps on them, okay, that's great. But if you try to take those 3 reps and try to do those 3 reps off of a exercise ball, the squish, the balls that you sit on that bounce, you're not going to be able to do that. Unstable platforms, like a ball, do not allow for you to be able to use the same resistance that you did. You're gonna have to go down in the resistance because it's unstable, and it's more prone for injury at that point too. So you're not going to be able to load like you could on a stable surface. So you have to think critically, what is it do I want more joint stabilization, or do I want more stability through increased strength? Okay, see, there's a difference to that. Okay, that's why sometimes when I kind of cringe sometimes when I look at like elite level athletes that are doing things on unstable surfaces. Yeah, I get what they're trying to do, but there's also been a lot of research that's shown, there's been some, excuse me, not a lot, there's been some, and it's very convincing actually, research that has shown that training on unstable surfaces actually decreases performance because you're turning on muscles that slow down movement, joint stabilization, versus you're trying to turn on motor units or muscles and nerves that are going to speed up. So it's really a catch-22. So you got to think about these things critically. Okay. Rep tempo. If you can see here, explosive, moderate, and slow. Well, the slower the repetition, the harder it is. Okay. But speed dictates what you're trying to achieve. If you're working that power and max strength level, you need to be explosive, which means there's no timetable. It means you're going to go eccentric or concentric first, whatever motion you're doing, and you're going to maximize the movement speed as best as you can while still keeping the weight controlled. You're not going to be going haphazardly. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, when you see it's moderate, what that means is it's what they say is a 202. That's a tempo. That's your tempo. 202. So 2 is 2 seconds, 0, yep, and then 2 again is 2 seconds. So what's happening is as you're doing, just say that I like to use barbell curls with this, for example. You have a barbell in your hand, you're trying to do bicep curls. Whatever weight you have it loaded on, it's going to be very difficult trying to do a max load under tempo. That's why it's explosive for max strength. But if you think about it, you have the barbell in your hand, and what you can do is you can either set a metronome or you can count it off in your head as best you can. You're going to go 1, 2, 1, 2, and that's exactly what that means. 2 seconds up, 2 seconds down. All right, which means that it's a 2-second eccentric, 0 seconds of isometric, and 2 seconds of concentric. Okay. Whereas if it was muscular endurance or stabilization, and just say you lowered the weight for that, the tempo is 4-2-1. So if you have that barbell in your hand again, and just say there's no weight added, it's just it's a 45-pound barbell, Olympic barbell, for that you're using. What you're going to do is, remember, it's eccentric, isometric, concentric, so it's in your hand. Okay. Now remember, it's 4-2-1. So what you're going to do is you're going to have that barbell in your hand starting down, and you pull it off the rack. Okay. Now it's in your hand. You're going to go 1, because remember, it's concentric. Remember, it's eccentric, isometric, concentric. That's your tempo. So it's going to go 1 up, and then it's going to go 1, 2, hold, 1, 2, 3, 4, down, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, lowered. And that's how that works. So you got to remember what the actual motion or what the muscle action is at that point. Is it eccentric, isometric, or concentric? Because you can't go 4, 2, 1, but concentric is slow on the way up. Because remember, that's the shortening of the muscle is the concentric. Well, that's not what you're doing when you're bringing the barbell up toward your chest or toward your shoulder. Okay, so you got to think about where it is that you're moving. Now, if that was a squat, this 4, 2, 1 would make sense because you're going to go 4 seconds lowered, hold 1, 2, and then 1 straight up. See, that's how that would work. But remember, it depends on what comes first in the movement. Is it eccentric or concentric? Okay. So obviously, the slower, the more impact you're going to have on those tissues that are going to be stressed. Slower velocities are going to put more demand on the muscles themselves. So therefore, the weight used or the weight lifted is not going to be as high as it would be as if you're trying to do things more explosively. Okay. Now, like it says here, it's important to build appropriate physiological foundations for specific forms of hypertrophy, strength, and power. So you have to have good bases of all of these things before you progress from one to the other. So you want to have adequate muscle mass, hypertrophy. From there, you want to be able to, from that hypertrophy and having the adequate amount of muscle mass, you want to use that muscle mass to improve the strength portion of everything. And then from that, having a good solid strength and muscle mass base, you can then work on trying to propel things in a quicker form. Okay, that's the part about repetition tempo that we want to do, is want to build, especially if we're using tempo. Okay, it's all about the building component of building or progression. Rest intervals, on the other hand, that's exactly what it sounds like. Recovery, rest periods. All right, it's meant to give you adequate recovery between your sets that you're doing based on the number of reps and sets that you're doing. And again, what adaptation you're looking for, what phase you want to be in, is really going to dictate what your rest interval is going to be. Okay, now it does, like it says here, it does have dramatic effect on the outcome of your training program, because if you're trying to do things very intense, having less rest periods can really harm when you're starting to get into that max strength and power base, because you have to have adequate recovery. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, has a little bit less recovery, because you're trying to just build fluid buildup inside of that muscle, or you're trying to stress soft tissues to where they're going to want to grow. Okay, so that's really the main factor there. So depending upon what your rest intervals are, it's going to be dependent upon what energy system you're going to be, what primary energy system you're going to be using, where you're going to be at. So typically you're not going to end up in a aerobic base when you're doing this, but what you can do is you can, depending upon reps and sets and rest period, you may end up working, not so much in that ATP PCR system anymore. You might be actually working in anaerobic glycolytic or the lactic acid system, which is more of a longer duration, where your heart rate might stay elevated, and through that you're not needing oxygen to burn fuels, but you're actually going to be requiring the buildup of lactic acid or lactate, because you're just constantly burning and using carbohydrates at that point. Okay, you're not so much relying upon high energy phosphates like ATP and PCR. Okay, so again, this right here, I thought there was a chart, but I guess not. With rest intervals, what you're looking at for again, muscle endurance and stabilization, they're again very similar. You're looking at anywhere between 0 to 90 seconds, but remember, you're on that 12 to 20 rep range, so a lot of time under tension. Okay. Hypertrophy is 0 to 60 seconds. I said it's short rest periods because you're constantly keeping those muscles engaged. Max strength and power both range from longer rest periods because they require it. Max strength is more about muscle fatigue, whereas power adaptations is muscle fatigue and nervous system fatigue. So you need that 3 to 5 minutes for either one of those phases, okay? But obviously it's dependent upon level of fitness, it's dependent upon what you're trying to achieve. So you can manipulate those as you go, but you don't want to stray too far from those numbers. And going above 5 minutes can get a little sketchy. And the reason why I say that is because typically people start to they kind of get that they start getting cold. Okay, would be the best way to put that. They start feeling cold. They feel like they haven't been doing something for a while, and then they go back to doing it. It feels like the first set all over again. So the more you start pushing over 5 minutes, sometimes the worse that can get. Okay, so you got to be very in tune to that. And the reason why we talk about rest intervals is because we want to be able to have this on the very bottom right here. This is the part you want to focus in on. We talk about ATP and PCR, okay? But if you look, these numbers are very important for recovery. They are very important for understanding why you're working in a specific level. And they're very important to understand like recovery for high energy phosphates, ATP, and PC or PCR. Okay, 20 to 30 seconds of resting gives you about 50% recovery of those high energy phosphates, which you need very predominantly in resistance training. 40 seconds gives you about 75% recovery. 60 seconds gives you about 85 to 90% recovery. And then 3 minutes gives you about 100% recovery. Not of muscle. It's recovery of ATP and PC, which means that you will not run out of high energy phosphates. Your system is actually able to rejuvenate ATP and PC so that you can continue on doing what you're doing. Okay? Because you cannot resistance train for long durations of time because ATP and PC become worn down and muscular fatigue will occur. Okay? But remember, it's because your energy levels are down, not so much as your muscles that are down. Okay, we have to remember that when we're talking about these resting periods here. Training volume, really when we talk about training volume, what is it? It's the total amount of work performed. For the most part, training volume really truly revolves around this method right here. It's usually reps times sets. So if you're doing 15 reps times a total of 10 sets, what you're really doing is you're getting 150 reps total for the movement. That's what we're talking about. Now, just say that you had 150 reps at 40 pounds per set. Okay, now we're talking about you take 150 times 40, so that's 6,000. So that means you had 6,000 total pounds of movement. Okay, that's how we can figure out things like that. This is, rep volume. Repetition volume is 15 times the 10. 15 reps, just so we have clarification. And it was 10 total sets of exercise movement that you did was equivalent to 150 reps total. But if each one of those sets had 40 pounds as the weight, that's 6,000 total pounds. Okay, that's what we're very much interested in. Okay, but that's volume. Well, it does vary per individual. It varies for a lot of reasons that are very specific to the goals and what you're trying to achieve as the person who is doing that. Well, the training phase definitely makes a difference. We said that goals, age. As you get older, the amount of volume should be dictated, for your age to make sure that you're not overstepping and then you can't recover, which is recoverability. All right, work capacity, how much work you're able to achieve is, are you able to handle a higher level of work? What's your nutritional status? Are you if you're in a deficit, just say that you're in a deficit, meaning you're trying to lose some weight and you're in a deficit for your diet, well, your volume might actually change. All right, if you're working with bodybuilders, their recoverability and their nutritional status are very, very scary as they get closer to competition, and then their soft tissue starts to really decline. Well, at that point there, the training volume has to go down to avoid injury, and then that leads you into injury history. If you're more prone to injury, then your volume needs to be dictated at a lower level. Life stress under, just say a person is having a rough time in their life and they're going through a life event. Well, then there it is. Your life stress is going to play a part there. Okay. So just kind of think about that in the back of your head when you're looking at this. All right. So with what are we looking for in terms of training volumes? Well, remember we said volume was reps times sets. So with high volume or low to moderate intensity, which we said hypertrophy fits into that moderate category, you're looking at increased muscle growth in muscle, increased muscle cross sectional area, increase muscle size. Okay, that's what we're looking at. Improve blood lipids, serum profile. So we're talking about HDLs, LDLs, VLDLs, and triglycerides and total cholesterol, all improving because of working at higher volumes. All right. And then you have an increased metabolic rate, so your ability to burn calories effectively and efficiently is up. And then with low volume, you're talking about increased rate of force production, which means that you are able to overcome a weight at a specific rate, of that load. So you're able to produce force to overcome the load, but at a specific speed. Okay, well, if it's increased, well, then we know that we could probably get more power output because your increased rate of force production is through the roof. There's an increased motor unit recruitment. The heavier things get, the higher the intensity and the lower the volume, you are going to require more motor units. The nerve and the muscle fibers that nerve works with are going to be recruited at a higher level. And then also because of that, you're going to have better synchronization with those motor units, meaning that they will be able to function correctly together because they need to be called upon at the right time. So those are some of the adaptations that will occur with specific volumes. Okay, so high volume does not always mean high level of reward. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, frequency, again, how many times you're going to work out in the course of a week. It is not appropriate to let your people work out 7 days a week. Okay, now you can take that with a grain of salt because there are people that do work out 7 days a week. But just understand that they are going through different levels of load. They are going through different levels of intensity. They're going through different amounts of volume during that time, because if you're trying to keep up high volume after trying to work out for weeks upon weeks, you're going to end up either overtrained, overreached, or injured. And that's not a good sign that you want to have. Okay. So with your training frequency, you want to think about some things. What are the goals? Again, age comes into play. What is your general health? If you're overweight or obese, your general health is not very good. All right. So therefore, you're going to end up having to diminish the amount of frequency until you can build up to and improve your general health to improve your frequency. What's your work capacity like? Again, if you're sedentary going to doing something, frequency needs to be down because your work capacity is very low. A more well-off person who has been training regularly for over 5+ years, say, their work capacity is very high. Okay. Nutritional status, again, well, again, if you're in a deficit, then it just depends on what you're trying to do with that. You can still have high frequency. Just understand that, recovery is going to be kind of not optimal at that point, and that can be very challenging on the body. So doing that for long periods of time may not be appropriate. Recoverability. Can you recover from a day-to-day basis, or are you a person who does a periodized split, meaning you're splitting up upper and lower body, or you're splitting up different, one day is intense, the next day is low intensity, so on and so forth. And then lastly, lifestyle and other stressors can, if you have to miss a training session because of a certain reason, then you got to miss a training session. But you have to understand that things get in the way. But then it's like, oh, I'm going to double up the next day. It's like, that may not be the best option, So you got to think critically about that. So again, what are what are some frequently used things? 3 to 5 days for strength. Doesn't mean it can't be 5 to 6, but again, you got to be very careful of the training load that you're putting on your system. Now, the last one is a little tricky too, but we'll explain that in a second. So at least 1 to 2 times per week is sufficient to maintain the physical, the physiological, and performance improvements achieved during other training phases. So typically, like we've talked about in the past, I believe we have talked about it, but if not, we'll talk about it right now, is that if you're going to work out 1 to 2 days a week, as long as the intensity stays up, you can work 1 to 2 days a week and you'll be able to maintain whatever gains that you have built. But understand that if you do not maintain intensity during that time, meaning, the load of training or, weight of lifting or whatever it may be, you'll start to see a diminishment of those particular parameters that you really wanted to maintain as best as possible. So if you're a person who travels a lot or work with people who travel a lot, getting into at least do some sort of training during a 1 to 2 day period during that time. It depends. You really need to make sure that your intensity is elevated if you're only going to be doing lower frequency. Okay. Duration is exactly what it is. It's the total amount of time that from start to finish of a particular workout. Now, if it's duration can also be total time throughout the week. So if it's however many times you work out per week times however long you worked out for, you can do it that way too. And that can be under management of stress. So that could be also something that you could work with as well. Excuse me. So training programs that exceed 60 to 90 minutes, it becomes tricky because you are typically, if you're going 60 to 90 minutes, usually there's a reason why you're doing that, and that could mean that you are training for a particular purpose. There might be you might be a competitor, you might be an athlete, but going over 90 minutes for the general run-of-the-mill person is starting to exceed a threshold that you don't need, because you're basically going to end up with a person who probably does not have the right work capacity, number one, and then number two, their body is not ready to do that, and they start to see diminished effects past that 90-minute mark. Like, they're not basically doing what they're supposed to do past that 90 minutes because it's starting to wear on them, so that affects them greatly. And then the rate of return on bad movements or tired body is not great either. So keeping within that 60 to 90 minutes is going to be okay. It's not going to affect them greatly, but understand that 60 to 90 minutes for a person who's sedentary coming to work out, that could be very excessive as well. So that might be 30 to 45 minutes. You don't know. You just have to be able to, it's your person. You have to be able to assess them correctly. With selection, well, again, what are you trying to achieve? This is very goal specific, and it's very specific to the person that you're going to be working with and what you want them to work within. But typically with stabilization, you're talking about things that are going to be more controlled, unstable, which is okay because you're working on joint stabilization. That is okay there. But if you're trying to do that during strength or power, that's going to affect the ability to build strength and power. So the muscular endurance and stabilization phases, those are typically going to be more controlled, unstable. They're typically going to be, it could be a total body routine. It could be split up. It could be multi or single joint. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve there. You might be doing supersetting with one exercise and following that with another exercise right after it. Whereas strength, again, it could be total body, it could be single, it could be multi-joint. So multi-joint meaning compound exercises like a squat or a deadlift or a bench press, things like that. And they're meant to be, controlled but moved explosively if possible. So you got to think critically about that. Now, if you think about the strength continuum or the force velocity, just understand that as the more force is needed, velocity goes down. As less force is needed, velocity goes up. So the speed of the bar or the piece of equipment that you're using will increase if the weight is low. The speed of the bar or the weight you're using, if it's high, speed will go down. Okay, but with power, same deal. Total body. Typically, it's multi-joint. There's usually no questions asked about that. It's not a single joint. And it's very explosive. It's supposed to be meant to push you through those sticking points. Okay. And remember, the weight that you're using for power is not very, very high. Remember, 30 to 45%. So you should be able to explode and move with those weights very quickly. Okay. They give you some exercise selections here. Again, you can go through the previous chapters for exercise selections. It's up to you, but they give you some examples here of multi and single joint types with some total body stuff as well. But again, remember in your power phases, you're looking at there isn't going to be anything for a single joint with your power phases because again, it's more typically total body or it's upper or lower in a very explosive form, but you're going to be using more than one joint area. So with exercise selection, with stabilization, we talked about these before, but again, floor to the balance beam or sport beam, a foam roller, half foam roller, foam pad, balance disc, a wobble board, and then a BOSU. So your BOSU is usually your last go-to resort on giving things unstable to people. So that's a challenge there. So giving somebody a BOSU within the first 2 weeks of them working out is highly inappropriate. You want to progress them accordingly depending upon the equipment that you have in your facility as well. With the lower body, how do we make things more challenging? Well, it's two legs stable. Then you can go staggered stance. You can go single leg stable, 2 legs unstable, staggered stance unstable, and then single leg unstable. Depending upon goals, who are the people you're working with, you may stop at any one of those initiatives at any point during that continuum. And then for upper body, 2 arm, alternating arm, single arm, and then single arm with a rotation and that's very, very challenging. Now, not to say that you have to do everything 2 arm, but there's definitely a benefit to doing 2 arm and at least at a minimum alternating, because that puts some unilateral work in there. So it doesn't, and then, if it's not alternating and you want to do single arm, that's true unilateral, meaning that it's going to help with breaking up asymmetries or imbalances from side to side. Okay. And that's with exercise selection. I know it's a lot to do with it, but these are things that you want to think about that are going to challenge a person, and depending upon where their goals are, where they are in their fitness level, where they are in their injury level, all of these things are going to make a big difference. Okay. So, now that you've kind of gone through the variables, it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? Okay, how am I going to program? Well, you need to think about the proper planning periods for what you're going to do. So it sounds simple, does sound simple, but one of the factors that you have to understand is that, and this is coming from observation from going to many facilities, there's a lot of trainers out there and a lot of coaches out there. Not a lot, I shouldn't say coaches. There's a lot of trainers, not as many coaches, that basically they plan for the day and they don't have a structured plan that's set up for that person. By periodizing the people that you're going to be working with will only help them to improve that much more than a person who is only planning for that particular day, because you don't have any progression, you don't have any way of showing improvement, you don't have any way of gauging where they're at from a baseline. Okay, that's really going to be important, because then at that point you can adjust to, and if we kind of scroll back through, you can adjust where you want them to be during each one of these. Okay, maybe you want 3 weeks of strength endurance followed by 4 weeks of max strength, followed by four to 5 weeks of hypertrophy, then to power. It just depends on what you're looking for. Or do you want to go phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each one of those phases wants to be 4 weeks long because that person is able to do that. That can be done. That's not unheard of. So you have to be slick on what you're thinking about of doing, because periodization basically controls the ability to overtrain. It diminishes fatigue overall, not just in that session. And it basically takes and diminishes, not removes the chance of, but diminishes the risk of injury. Okay. So how do you want to do it? Well, you have your annual plans, your monthly plans, and your weekly plans. Now, these are all exactly what they sound like. Annual, it's a yearly plan. A monthly plan is, it's going to be more detailed It's going to be more detailed for a monthly plan because you're getting closer to those individualized. Whereas the weekly plan is going to give you exactly what you want to do for that week. That's more of the puzzle piece. The monthly plan is like, oh, well, I've put together the whole border, and then the annual plan is all of the puzzle completely filled. Okay. Well, what do we call them? We call them macro, meso, and micro cycles. An annual plan is a macro cycle. A monthly plan is a meso, and a weekly plan is a micro. Okay, that's the cycles that you want to break them down into. Now, microcycles, they are weekly plans. Well, what are the weekly plans divided up into? Daily plans. So it could be weekly and daily. Okay. So, you've seen the OPT model before. We know about phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's break them down. Okay. What are we doing in stabilization? Okay. What is the main job? Okay, the main adaptation here is basically to get a good base of support to be able to then allow the body to prepare for higher demands when you get to the muscle endurance, the hypertrophy, the max strength, and the power phases. If you assume that your people are going to go up to those levels, maybe not to level 5, or phase 5, but somewhere in there. What's the goals? Correct muscle imbalances. Absolutely. We said asymmetries are no good and side-to-side differences are bad. So you can take a person, even an athlete should be going back down to a stabilization sort of exercise programming after their season is over. Well, it's going to correct some imbalances that they've occurred over the course of a season. Okay. It's going to improve core stabilization for that musculature that you're going to need. It's going to basically like it says, prevent tissue overload. So it's basically going to allow recovery of an improved functioning and stabilizing and strength of soft tissue. And the joints, of course, that are being protected by that soft tissue. Okay. Then it's going to then, at that point there, you can have some improved cardiorespiratory and neuromuscular conditioning, meaning that there's high levels of volume here that it's gonna take its toll on lung and heart function, and then it's gonna take its toll on muscle and nerve connection because you're gonna have a nervous system fatigue because you're constantly recruiting for longer rep periods. But that's okay because you're building the support and the foundation that you need for proper movement and for getting technique up to par and back to where it's supposed to be. Okay, so that's your stabilization. So again, first time people should be here. There's no excuse why you should be going up to max strength levels with a brand new person. They need to show you that they can move correctly and that things, meaning muscles, fire effectively, and it shows it here. Okay, you need to optimize your stabilization and posture. Okay, so what are you going to do? What we would call multiplanar, multiple planes of motion. So sagittal, frontal, transverse, proprioceptively enriched, meaning that the body is sensing change and movement at an optimal level so that you can then recruit joint stabilization or joint stabilizers. So you're going to have high neuromuscular control. You're going to have higher functional strength, meaning that you can move in most areas. Okay. Now, you've seen these numbers before. They're not new. But understanding that these are the levels that you want to be at when you're working within flexibility, core, balance, plyo, SAQ, and then resistance training. You want to work at the number of reps, the sets, the tempo. Intensity doesn't really matter for the first, but when you get to resistance, again, it's 50 to 70%. Rest periods are what they are. Remember, 0 to 90, and then go from there. Frequency, duration, and then exercise selection. Now, look at the numbers that you need and go from there. And that's where you can start programming effectively for your stabilization phase. Strength. Now, stabilization, remember here too that when you look at this, a lot of the same factors are going to be used for muscular endurance. Okay. Whereas with strength, we're going to talk about hypertrophy and max strength. Okay. What are we looking at here? The ability of the core musculature to stabilize the pelvis under, basically the LPHC under heavier loads, and we still want to get full range of motion. As weight gets heavier, you do not want to change the range of motion. It's just going to be more taxing on the system for that range of motion. Load bearing. should be load bearing, weight bearing. It's going to provide compressive forces for joints, which is going to help strengthen them. Okay. Different volumes, different rep sets and intensities. All right. Because of that, you're going to put different demands versus stabilization, where it's more anaerobic, more ATP, PC, and then, like I said, this is glycolysis, but really it's anaerobic glycolysis or the lactic acid system. So you're looking at ways to be able to function in that anaerobic system, that functioning of those systems. Okay, so what are we looking at here? There could be potential weight loss. There could be some muscle mass increase, whatever it may be. Okay, and then increase the motor unit recruitment, frequency of the motor unit recruitment, and then the synchronization. That's for max strength. Okay, so you're going to recruit more motor units, you're going to recruit more nerves and muscles, you're going to discharge more motor units, frequency of how their discharge, and then you're going to synchronize them, meaning they're going to sync up better and they're going to work together better to be able to give you a more fluid motion. Okay. So with phase 2, that's your strength endurance. We kind of talked a little bit about it with the stabilization because the parameters are very similar. But what are we trying to do? I hit on this term before, but supersetting, 2 exercises back to back. So what you want to do here is you're going to improve upon your stabilization endurance, and you're going to hit on your strength endurance. And what it is, it's a stable exercise followed by a stabilization exercise. So an exercise that you might have done in phase 1, you're going to bring back around again. So it's going to be a stable exercise, like they say here, a bench press, followed by something that's unstable, like a stability ball push-up, or maybe on a Bosu ball, or whatever it may be. So again, what are we doing? Getting prime movers to get fatigued, and then also we're trying to get more dynamic joint stabilization, which is very, very important to build a better base of support outside of the stabilization phase, because we're getting into something a little more challenging. So with strength endurance, you can see here, we can pick the reps, sets, tempo. All right, you can look through this on your own. I'm not going to regurgitate everything because it's clear as day for you in front of you, and you can see exactly where you want to be, for how long of a duration, how many times a week, for what you're looking for, okay, in terms of selection, okay? On the other hand, phase 3, which is hypertrophy, now you're talking about volume change. You're talking about, well, volume change for exercise, but also volume change for, muscle mass, okay? What are we looking for? We're trying to get muscle size growth or overall increase in muscle size. That's what our focus is here, maximal hypertrophy. When we're looking at everything, this phase is pretty cut and dry when it comes to what we're trying to achieve. It's really not, we don't have to look too deep into it, because it is. We're trying to gain max muscle size as we're genetically, allowed. Look at your levels here. This is what we're talking about: rep sets, your volume, your exercise selection, how many times a week. This is going to be a tough one. Hypertrophy phases are very tough because you're trying to get growth, but you're basically working at moderate weight, moderate reps, and then you're working at moderate weight, moderate reps, and then moderate rest periods. So the rest period is not very long for what you're trying to achieve, especially when you start getting up into that higher 70s and lower 80% range, when 8 reps and 10 reps feel like an eternity, and you start to really feel those muscles start getting really fatigued and very wiped out. Strength. With strength, we're talking about max strength here. Increasing the load that's placed on body tissues. So again, on muscle, on the joint connections. So you're talking about ligaments, then you're talking about muscle connections of tendons, and then just kind of beefing up that articular cartilage that's around the bone itself. All right, we're trying to use heavy loading here. Lower rep counts, lower rep counts. Volume can be wherever you want it to be, depending upon the day. So we're looking for increased firing rates and synchronization of our motor units. So we talked about those. Firing rate, meaning you're firing off quicker, and there's a rapid discharge. That's why you need more recovery. Okay. It does say not appropriate for all clients here. So what you need to realize is that if you're working with somebody who wants to get stronger, we can be here. But remember, not everybody needs to be in this phase. Okay. It's an optional phase depending upon goals. There's your numbers. Again, resistance-wise, lower reps, no tempo, higher weight. Okay. So be very, very specific about what you're trying to achieve there. Power, again, trying to get more speed of muscle contraction, or what we would call rate of force production. Okay, we're trying to increase the speed of our movement or the velocity of our movement. We're trying to increase rate of force production. What are we trying to do? Number of motor units activated. We're trying to sync them up better, and then we're trying to speed them up as they become excited. Okay, that's what, and everything needs to work coordinated, efficiently, effectively, and with high demand and optimal technique. Okay, now what you can do here with power is you can work on a superset again, where you're doing a strength exercise followed by a very explosive power exercise. So just depending upon what you're trying to achieve, it's going to be a strength-based exercise, heavy, 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 followed by a lighter loaded speed movement. Okay, so think about what it is that you might be doing there that might be very challenging to you. Okay, but it's going to be superset based, which makes it even more challenging and more demanding on the system. That's why it's the last phase, and again, may not be applicable to everybody. But if you're looking again, there's your parameters. If you look resistance wise, 1 to 5 reps for your strength, 8 to 10 reps for your power, back to back. Very, very demanding on the system. Okay, one strength superset with one power. So it's gonna be very, very tough on the body. You can see here that if you're working in the power, you can see where things have changed. You've seen where there's some controlled exercise, for balance and flexibility. Look at your rest intervals; they're not the same as what they are for your resistance. Okay, so just be clear on that. So those are your 5 phases. Okay, well that's great and all, but what are you going to do? And how are you going to apply this? Well, what are the common goals? What are you looking at doing for a person? There are some very similar, reducing body fat, increasing muscle mass, making it better as a performer. Okay, if any, so we're talking about weight management factors, body composition factors, and then performance factors. That's really what we want to, that's how we can apply it here, and we want to sit in those parameters that we just talked about. That will make it so that you can start getting to an achievement point, and then from there you can start making changes needed to manipulate your variables a little bit and make it a little bit more challenging. Maybe one day you want to be in strength, the next day you want to be in power, and that's called undulating periodization, where you're moving from one phase to the other. Well, again, that's not for everybody. That's more for the person who really wants to try and to improve beyond what a regular person wants to, and it's again maybe not suitable for everybody. All right. But again, with reduction of body fat, you're burning more calories than you're consuming. Typically, diet needs to be in a better place. So you want to make sure that you're in an appropriate nutritional status to make sure that you're okay for doing this with reductions of body fat. Phases 1, 2, and 3 will definitely help with that. Will make it more challenging, especially when you start getting into phase 2, where you start supersetting everything more. And then phase 3 is definitely optional. So phase 3 being hypertrophy. But if you're trying, again, increased muscle mass helps burn calories more metabolically. So that can also help as well. Again, you're definitely going to be looking at phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 for this. But again, having a good solid base in 1 and 2, phases 1 and 2, stabilization, and then strength endurance. Okay, phase 3 is definitely hypertrophy, which you're going to get body, increases in body mass, definitely there. And then here's where it gets a little tricky. And sometimes I think we need to pay attention a little bit to this one a little bit more to understand what I'm going to say here. What's going to happen is when you're working under certain loads, if you're in a hypertrophy phase, when you're trying to lift for more muscle mass, you will not be, well, okay, if you're at a higher fitness level and you're lifting for size gain, meaning you're trying to get more muscle mass, it's going to be very difficult, if you will at all, increase the amount of maximum strength that you have unless you come in with a little bit less strength because you're not as experienced. But an experienced person who lifts and exercises a lot, they're going to have a hard time getting max strength when they're working in the hypertrophy phase. Although, on the other hand, if you're working in a maximum strength phase, you have an ability to increase muscle mass size. Maybe not to the same extent if you were working on hypertrophy alone, but max strength can incorporate size increase because the muscles are being taxed more, they're being challenged more, and they have a way to expand and grow. Whereas vice versa is not true, where hypertrophy is not guaranteed to increase your max strength. So just kind of put that into perspective, okay? And then lastly, for your sport performance, yeah, I mean, again, phases 1 and 2 are definitely going to help because they're going to help you keep yourself balanced, and it's going to keep you working at higher repetitions and loading. Maybe not heavy loading, but high loading, lots of volume. And then obviously phase 5 or power phase is definitely going to be there for you for appropriate explosiveness for what you're trying to achieve. Now, there are some things found in the textbook that you can look through. Definitely pay attention to them. The other thing is, you need to be aware that sport performance, just so you're aware, it can be all phases because, again, athletes still need adequate. Typically, you want to grow athletes before they get into their performance levels or their competition phases. You want to build up their muscle mass somewhat so that when their season comes around and they can't work out as often, they can, maybe work out 1 to 2 days a week. There you go again. Working out 1 to 2 days a week, upping the intensity helps maintain or try to diminish the amount of muscle mass they may lose during competition season. So, again, max strength, same thing. They're going to lose some strength during the season. But again, if we can keep that intensity up and work out 1 to 2 days a week to kind of save some of that strength, it's going to help them toward the end of the season when they're going to be starting to become more run down. So always think about these things and put them into perspective that way. Okay. So again, pay attention to your book, pay attention to the diagrams, pay attention to the tables. For test taking purposes, those are definitely going to be things that are going to be in there. They're definitely going to be focused on because they want to know if you're paying attention to reps and sets. They want to know if you're paying attention to rest time because all those variables are very important for when it comes to actual physical programming. So, chapter 14 is a lot, but it's something that you definitely need to pay attention to because it's going to be the bread and butter of what you need to focus on to make your people better. Everything else leading up to this point is kind of like a culminating effect until it finally hits you that, okay, how do I put this stuff together? And here it is. This is general approaches to everything. There are obviously other ways that you can go about doing this, but this is using the OPT model very effectively so that you can use it to start your template, to start your process of being able to start programming effectively and start working within parameters so you don't beat your clients up too much and make them so wiped out that they can't continue the next week. They need 5 days of recovery. Not appropriate either. So again, put that into perspective, use all these variables correctly, look at your phases, and know where you want to put your people, and that will really help you as you move through as a professional, but it'll also make you understand what to focus in on for your test questions that you're going to be looking at. So, as always, thanks for listening. And again, chapter 14, probably one of the more important chapters of this book because it takes everything and puts it together. So, very good focal point here. So, have a great day and hope to hear from you soon.